is a place that's not only real but imagined. John Steinbeck made it an icon for this industry and for literature in the early 1940s. All of the workers, all of the processing were included in his novel that dwelt with a series of devotees, folks who lived here that were very interesting characters.
Some of Steinbeck's characters lived in workers' houses like these.
There were hundreds of shacks like this one on Cannery Row, built to house the male workers of a variety of nationalities. This one happens to be for Tanaka and Okamoto, who were really two Japanese fishermen. Very sparse, limited activity. They paid a few dollars a month to live here. Often they would go to clubs that they established. These were educated people for the most part. The Japanese had their own newspapers. The Japanese had the Nichibei, which was published in San Francisco. They had their own cultural activities in the area. There was a Japanese Presbyterian church in Monterey, later on a Buddhist temple. So there was a cultural life as well as a working life here on Cannery Row.
Most workers were single, and many were political refugees from Asia or Latin America.
Monterey's canning industry begins at the turn of the 20th century in Monterey proper, when a man by the name of Booth from the American River near Sacramento determines that the salmon in Monterey Bay can be canned as a commercial product. Canning industry itself was made up in two sections, the fishermen and the processing. The fishermen were primarily Sicilians who had come to Monterey at the turn of the century with Booth to establish the salmon fishing. There were also Portuguese, there were Chinese, Japanese. It was just a very, very broad cultural mix of people. The process itself brought the fish from the boat into the cannery where they were gutted and heads cut off. The cutters were primarily Asian men and women, and the packers, interestingly enough, were exclusively women. This was one of the first industries in the United States that used a very large workforce of women.
Steinbeck was born in nearby Salinas in 1902. Today, themes from his novels decorate the city's houses. Steinbeck liked outsiders as protagonists in his work, and the people of the fertile Salinas Valley were given key roles. Steinbeck spent some time working as a reporter in New York for The American, then moved back to California. At first, his books were poorly received, and he was forced to accept all sorts of odd jobs to support his family. His experience as a fruit picker later figured in his novel East of Eden. Today, Steinbeck's house and old neighborhood are popular tourist attractions in Salinas. In the reactionary political climate of the 1950s, John Steinbeck was accused of being a communist because of his preference for portraying common folk, laborers and farmers in his work. Where once his books were banned, the city now has a museum honoring its most famous son. The rooms of the National Steinbeck Center are decorated with memorabilia of the author who received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1962. We have an appointment with the author's son. Thomas Steinbeck is an author and writes screenplays. For him, a visit to the museum is a trip down memory lane with the old Ford a good companion.
On Sundays, sometimes my father liked to take target practice, and he'd take his .30-30 Winchester, right? And he'd sit up in his porch and he'd shoot holes into this car, right? Old rusting car down below it. And he never really went to visit the damage. He was just, being playful, right? Wasting ammunition and shooting this car.
Steinbeck had a multifaceted career, and the museum displays relics from his days as a war reporter in both World War II and Vietnam. There are also mementos of his life as a laborer.
I like the short stories because I'm a short story writer, the best, okay? But I think In Dubious Battle is a model for The Grapes of Wrath, which is very political. It's about American communist organizers in the fields of California. And it's very funny when you say American communist, because There's like no way that any American would ever agree with a straight communist line because they're too cantankerous. You know, they can't even agree among themselves. So, but he uses them as a model. He got in a lot of trouble for talking about it. My father said you don't become a great writer till you've been dead for 20 years. You know, so if you've got big ambitions, sort of forget it, right? And it's a tendency in America at some particular point to, I guess maybe for tourism or just for edification, to honor whatever favorite son that is, right, and put up some establishment. But this is the biggest one I know of in America.
For Thomas Steinbeck, all this hype about his famous father is mystifying, and he's quite nonchalant about businesses' enthusiastic use of the Steinbeck name.
There's Steinbeck this and Steinbeck that. There's Steinbeck jewelers and Steinbeck real estate dealers and Steinbeck wineries. And I finally got my revenge, though. I just tell people I own all that stuff.
All irony aside, Thomas Steinbeck is visibly proud of his father.
When was the last time you saw a museum dedicated to one painter? Or one potter? Or one... I mean, I don't know what my father would have thought about this, but I think he'd find it a little bizarre.
You won't, because I didn't try to help with everything I know, and that's not as a fact.
That makes it difficult to be here, because I like being invisible. And I like hanging out. It makes it very difficult. Celebrity makes it difficult to go hang out and listen to other people talk, because they're always aware of who you are, you know, and they don't. Sometimes they don't want to talk, or sometimes they perform, you know, wanting your attention. So being here is not an easy thing for me. This town is, it's this and Monterey. John Steinbeck, the father, belongs to me. John Steinbeck, the author, belongs to everybody else. And there's a very fine dividing line. So what I would say personally of what he would think may not actually be the truth, because the father's son, I mean, how much do you really know about your father, and vice versa?
Every day, the museum runs excerpts of films based on Steinbeck's novels. Lectures are held regularly, and during the term, school classes make up a large percentage of visitors. For young, aspiring authors, there are also writing courses. At the end of the railroad tracks in Monterey, a statue commemorates the marine biologist who played a vital role both in the history of Cannery Row and the city itself.
Ed Ricketts was a close friend of John Steinbeck. In fact, Steinbeck used him in his literature, both Cannery Row and Sweet Thursday, as the character for Doc Ricketts, Doc Ricketts' lab. He did have a laboratory on Cannery Row called Pacific Biological Laboratories, where he would prepare specimens for high schools.
There is a seal beach in Monterey Bay, and every year a great colony gathers here. The animals evidently feel safe. California researchers have discovered that the seal's vision is adapted perfectly for both land and sea. However, further research indicates that human interference and modern shipping have been hugely disorientating for these mammals. The seals share the beach and the ocean's nutrient-rich bounty with seabirds, fish, dolphins, and whales. Below the old fish cannery is probably one of the world's largest and most beautiful aquariums. Initiated by Steinbeck's friend Ed Ricketts and financed by David Packard, co-founder of Hewlett-Packard, it cost around $55 million. Every minute, 7,500 liters of seawater is pumped through its tanks. In his novel Cannery Row, Steinbeck wrote about the pioneering work of his friend Doc Ricketts. Doc was collecting marine animals in the great tide pool on the tip of the peninsula. It's a fabulous place. When the tide is in, a wave-churned basin creamy with foam, whipped by the combers that roll in from the whistling buoy on the reef. But when the tide goes out, the little water world becomes quiet and lovely. The sea is very clear. The bottom becomes fantastic with hurrying, fighting, feeding, breeding animals. Crabs rush from frond to frond, of the waving algae. Starfish squat over mussels and limpets, attach their million little suckers, and then slowly lift with incredible power until the prey is broken from the rock. What fascinated Steinbeck has become the subject of extensive modern research. We find animal behavior so compelling because while animals lack our verbal linguistic skills, they are nonetheless able to communicate complex processes. Almost 60 years after the publication of Steinbeck's Cannery Row, the street brought to life in the work of this great American author continues to attract more than 3 million visitors a year. And for them, the rough and tough era of early 20th century Monterey and the colorful characters who inhabited it will live on forever.